Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight, my guest is Recluse, aka Steven Snyder. Before I bring him on, I want to thank sponsors, C60 Purple Power, which is a necessity for me now. I feel better than I have in years. I have more energy, better sleep. I've lost weight. The benefits are amazing. C60 is a super antioxidant. It eliminates free radicals. Check out their website to learn more. Click the link in the description, and you can use coupon code KNOWLEDGE10 to get 10% off your order plus free shipping. Tonight, I want to welcome back to the show Recluse, or Steven Snyder. He is the longtime curator of the VISUP, or VISUP website, which is dedicated to parapolitics and high weirdness in all their many forms. After nearly a decade in the blogging racket, he's branched out into podcasts. With Frank Zero of Zero Night, he co-hosts The Farm, a weekly podcast dedicated to parapolitics and synchromysticism. His first book was co-authored with Frank Zero, entitled Strange Tales of the Parapolitical, Post-War Nazis, Mercenaries, and Other Secret History. Tonight we're going to discuss his second book, A Special Relationship, Trump, Epstein, and the Secret History of the Anglo-American Establishment. Steven, welcome back. How are you doing tonight?
Doing great, Chris. Thanks for having me back, man.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Last time you were on, we talked about your first book, Strange Tales of the Parapolitical, which ties into your new book because, of course, it involves some of the key players showing up throughout modern history when it comes to corruption, scandals, cults, conspiracies, assassinations, sex trafficking, culture creation, psychological warfare operations, and much more. And tonight we're going to discuss your new book, which covers a 6 decades old scandal, which is linked to both Epstein's ring and the assassination of JFK. But first, I'd love to get your thoughts on how things have progressed since we last spoke, which was in April of this year. A lot has happened since we've talked. The world has become more strange and surreal, and I feel like we're living in a really bad movie that just won't end. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing, but I mean, in a lot of ways, I think it's an inevitable conclusion of a lot of the things that have been playing out now for years. Ironically, I just did a presentation at the Strange Realities Con for the Conspiranormal guys, and the general gist of the presentation was that consensus reality has effectively totally broken down. I mean, it's been an ongoing project from various groups. I mean, some amateurs, some, affiliated with intelligence services and what have you. But I kind of go back to the enigmatic cybernetic cultural research unit at Warwick University in the 1990s, who really pumped the whole idea of accelerationism and what have you that's become so popular in certain circles now. The most infamous member of them was, of course, Nick Land, who became the spokesman for the neo-reactionary / dark enlightenment in recent years. But originally, they came together to apply cybernetic principles to the emerging communication technologies, specifically the internet. Of course, this would have been circa like 1993, 1994, when a lot of this stuff was just getting off the ground. And they came to the conclusion that the internet was melting down consensus reality. Certainly, I mean, in the infancy of it, that's a rather disturbing proposition. And I mean, now we're a good almost, quarter century now past that point. And then on top of that, I mean, you really have had the major rise of conspiratainment, which, again, is another form of, I think, essentially also melting down consensus reality. So, I mean, you're just being people constantly bombarded with so many narratives from the left, from the right. There is no more unity in how people perceive things effectively. I mean, historically, the gatekeepers of the establishment, I mean, they had so many cable networks, they had so many major publications and so forth. It was easy to create a coherent narrative to orient societies around. We really just don't have that anymore. Some of it, I mean, now is happening because of ongoing psychological warfare efforts. But then, of course, I mean, you've got a lot of amateur players in it too, kind of doing their own assault on reality, so to speak. So it's definitely heady stuff that we're living in right now, that's to be sure.
Yeah, it's coming at you from all angles every day. I try not to watch any of the news myself because it just melts my brain. But you got to just kind of keep your eye on some of the strangeness going on. But let's get into your book now. This your series of books. It's going to be a trilogy, right?
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about the overall scope of things. I guess we should start with kind of a brief review of your first book and how it ties into this next one.
Well, the first book was, kind of a collection of essays that I did, and then Frank had contributed to the introduction, and then the one on the RFID chip. One of the essays was on Colonia Dignidad. Another one was on the Mellon family. And then the third one was on the rise of the private military industry. The newest work ties in, of course, to the Mellon essay quite a bit because which William Mellon Hitchcock appears yet again in this particular work. I've written quite a bit about William Mellon Hitchcock. I'm hoping now that I've done this rather extensive take on him in a special relationship, I can finally be done with him for now. I mean, he is a quite a fascinating character, but yeah, it's been years now that I've been chronicling this guy, and I'm sick and tired of writing about the bastard. But also, of course, kind of getting back to the rise of the private military industry, I kind of focused more on Strange Tales of the Parapolitical on the recent developments in the private military industry. But in this particular work, I'm going back to really the foundation of the modern PMCs, how that got going, and all that good stuff. So, I mean, there is sort of that lineage there at play.
And I'm sure you did a full trilogy because just to focus on like certain players like Epstein, for example, it wouldn't bring enough of the full picture, I suppose, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, originally when I had started it, I was thinking, it'll be one book. And then I think after writing about like 2 chapters or something like that, I was still in like the 1940s or something, and it was up to like 20,000 words already. And I was like, this just isn't going to work. If I tried to do this as one book, it's going to be like 300, 400,000 words. I mean, it's going to rival, War and Peace or something like that, Tragedy and Hope. So anyway, the decision was then made to break it into a trilogy where hopefully it would be more manageable for people who haven't spent a lifetime studying this kind of stuff. So yeah, the first one essentially is going to kind of chronicle things from the interwar years between the world wars up to Profumo in 1964. And then the second one, we're going to be getting into a bit in the, from the mid 60s, picking up into like probably the early 80s. And then finally, the third one will get in from the 80s up to the modern day and hopefully wrap up everything.
Now, obviously, there are different factions involved in this, and your book focuses a little bit on the right side of the power pyramid globalist faction. Now, let's talk about where do these factions originate? What are they? Could you kind of give us a little bit of a brief history on what we're dealing with here?
Yeah, well, that was kind of the whole purpose of writing the introduction to it, to sort of explain the American geopolitical situation. And I mean, really, the factions go back, I mean, practically to the founding of the country, sort of the split between the Federalists and the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans, if you will. And there was always really a question of, what we were going to be more oriented towards. The Federalists saw us as, essentially reintegrating ourselves into the European community and trying to maintain close ties with Britain and the other colonial empires. And then conversely, the Jeffersonians were all about manifest destiny and the continuous westward expansion and so forth. And in a lot of ways, that's still, at the heart of a lot of the disputes between the ruling factions in this day and age. Manifest destiny continued pretty much unabated until, roughly the 1850s. By that point in time, we had established all of the, what is currently the continental United States. And then from there, things hit a bit of a snag with the Civil War, the whole period of Reconstruction, and then it really got going again with the rise of the McKinley presidency. towards the end of the 19th century. And basically then the question was, well, where are we going to continue Manifest Destiny? I mean, the only place left now is further into the Pacific to continue now to essentially try to bring colonization to Asia. And that was a big dispute. I mean, a lot of people always wanted a closer relationship with the old countries, with the UK, with France, and that type of thing. And once again, this became an issue in the aftermath of the Second World War. You had the communist insurrection that essentially turned into the Civil War, and finally the triumph of the Chinese Communist Party over there. You had the whole situation with the most of Eastern Europe falling under the Soviets. The United States was the most powerful country in the world at the time, but we just did not have the military capabilities to hold off the communist advance in both regions of the world. So what are we going to do? That kind of led to a great debate. Ultimately, the point of emphasis was given to Europe. We tried to some extent in Asia, but after several decades and quite a bit of military expenditures, we basically were left with nothing on continental Asia and that region of the world except for a little toehold in Korea. So, that's been an ongoing issue, I would say, with a certain faction within the ruling establishment. And certainly in this modern day and age, once again, the question of Asia has become a major factor again. I mean, you're seeing this playing out right now with the, two factions within the elite in this country. Are we going to be more oriented towards Russia? Are we going to be more oriented towards the People's Republic of China? Certainly, I mean, if Trump wins, I would say that we're going to continue to see the endless jingoism against China, probably even ratcheted up a few levels. And if Biden wins, you're probably going to see, if not a total de-escalation of things with China, at least a little bit more of an emphasis going back to Russia. So, this is something that's really been with us as a nation from really the founding of the country, and it's still playing out in this current day.
Now, when it comes to your book, you point out the historical ties of, Skull and Bones to the American conservative establishment. Talk a little bit about that and how that's, so important to what ties into all of this.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting because, I mean, within the conservative establishment, you really have got kind of the two wings, the neocons on the one hand, and the really far right on the other hand. They would have been, I guess, termed isolationist, quote unquote, effectively prior to the Second World War. I mean, of course, in this sense, isolationist was basically just saying we don't want to get involved in European colonial wars, but not so much in our own colonial wars in Asia or Latin America, but whatever. Anyway, as far as Skull and Bones goes, it goes back to a rather prominent bonesman named Henry Stimson, who was the Secretary of War under Taft and then later under FDR, lifetime Republican, but he was brought into FDR's administration to kind of smooth over some feathers as we were getting ready to go into World War II. And Stimson brought a lot of other bonesmen and other hawks into the War Department, which of course became the Defense Department not long afterwards, but also the State Department. A lot of these guys, like Harriman and these types of people, eventually became the kind of nucleus of a clique of foreign policy advisors known as the Wise Men. A couple of them were bonesmen, and the broader kind of foreign policy establishment, this professional foreign policy establishment that emerged at the end of the Second World War was, in a lot of cases, drawn for the ranks of Skull and Bones. But these guys were really hawkish, much more so than they're usually given credit for by many conspiracy theorists. Essentially, these were the guys who coined the whole concept of containment against the Soviet Union, as opposed to sort of UN-based globalism that was very much favored by the business community at the time. So these guys are in the administration of FDR. They continue to thrive in Truman. They continue to have a lot of presence in the Kennedy administration. But then their successors getting into the 70s have become very disillusioned with the Democrats. And effectively, they jumped ship and became the nucleus of what we now think of as the neoconservatives. Paul Nitze, for instance, would be a good example of one of the guys who was sort of groomed by these bonesmen in the War Department going back to the 40s, who eventually kind of became a leading neocon in the late 70s, early 80s. So that's kind of your genesis of the neocons. On the other hand, you've got your quote-unquote isolationists, and the rallying point for this was Taft. I guess it was Robert Taft, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, William Howard, I believe, was his father who was the president. But Robert Taft was the major isolationist during the lead up to the Second World War. He was also known as Mr. Republican, and he effectively became the spokesman for this, movement in the aftermath of the Second World War. Though now they had rebranded themselves as more proponents of massive military intervention in Asia at this point, which was really always the objective in the first place. But Taft was really sort of the nucleus for now what we would think of as the America First types. Taft had never actually joined the America First Committee during the interwar years, but he was very favorably disposed towards it, to put it mildly. But ever the politician, he avoided actually directly aligning himself with it. But another interesting thing about America First, too, that's not really talked about is it had its origins actually at Yale University, which is, of course, where Skull and Bones was housed as well. Another big guy, and that was William Buckley, too, kind of a, I guess, midway point between the neocons and maybe some of the more far right-wing types. But Buckley, of course, the big publishing empire with the National Review, the author of Man, God, and Yale, and of course another rather infamous Bonesman. But it is really interesting, though, of course, with the way the Bonesmen are depicted by so many conspiracy theorists, even though arguably you could say that they've had a lot more of an influence on the Republican Party. I mean, certainly in the recent era.
Now, when it comes to Skull and Bones, and you just mentioned different conspiracy theories, what would you say is the actual occult aspect that is really actually practiced by the Skull and Bones in reality?
Well, I mean, it's really hard to say. I mean, even if they do so much of the old school stuff anymore, I mean, Skull and Bones really seems like it's a pretty marginal thing in this day and age. I mean, Bush, too, and Kerry really seem like they were the last wave of really prominent Bonesmen. Well, I guess, what is it, Trump's, was it Munchin or something? Somebody in the cabinet, I think, now is a Bonesman, but I mean, he's one of the only really recent ones I can think of. But in terms of the actual initiation rituals, I mean, what we've come out with, I mean, seems like a fairly standard practices that are used by a lot of cults. Certainly confession is a big part of it. The whole process of, what is it, getting naked in a coffin and essentially revealing some of your darkest secrets and so forth. I mean, this sort of confessional approach in a lot of my different dealings and research into cults is really common. I mean, you look at moral rearmament or the Unification Church to sort of give you examples of nominally Christian cults. It's a similar type of process. I know in moral rearmament, it was, what was it, spiritual surgery or something that one of the more less favorably disposed people referred to as spiritual nudism. But yeah, I mean, a lot of times that is a major part of creating this sort of hold over followers, is putting them in a vulnerable situation like this, having them confess some of the most shameful things in their life, and then having that over them, as well as that sort of degrading experience to go with it. It's a very profound psychological thing that, I mean, really has been known to many cults in various forms for centuries now.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine the mentality that goes on some of those higher levels and those initiations. Very strange to me. Earlier, you mentioned the rise of neoconservatism, and I'd like you to talk about. You wrote about the significance of the Roosevelt family on neoconservatism. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, oh yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was essentially the patron saint, really, if you want to get down to it, of neoconservatism. I mean, very much America first, but I mean, American empire first. Just a major proponent of the massive military buildup of the United States, a major proponent of just manifest destiny, of the, white man's burden, if you will, the divine right of the United States to continue expanding ever into the West. Roosevelt really brought a lot of rampant militarism. I mean, of course, it's always been to some extent evident in the country, but I mean, he really mainstreamed it a lot. And certainly the foreign policy gurus who had cut their teeth with him, I mean, they were another sort of part of this, clique that either became the wise men with those bonesmen and what have you that I was just alluding to. But this continued on. I mean, a lot of people don't realize it, but quite a few of his relatives would also end up in the CIA and in the Pentagon in senior roles. But I mean, some of the most notorious ones would have been Kermit Roosevelt or Kim Roosevelt, the coup master who had been involved in the the Iranian coup, and also some of the intrigues in Egypt against the British and so forth. Another one was Archibald Roosevelt, who ironically was the CIA station chief at the time of the Profumo affair in London. He had also had some dealings with the coup in Iran back in the early 50s and so forth. So, I mean, he kind of brought this whole warrior mentality in a lot of ways into the Republican Party, and it was something that his family had continued onward with. And then, of course, there was his, I think his immediate son, Theodore Roosevelt II, who had been approached for the business plot, effectively, to depose of FDR, going back into the 1930s. So, yeah, the whole history of that family is really fascinating, and you just don't really hear very much about them, even though they had a tremendous influence on shaping modern American foreign policy and effectively the American empire. And, again, he is very much the patron saint of neoconservatism and that whole mindset of this America-dominated world.
Talk a little bit about the roundtable movement, specifically Quigley's Roundtable, and how it plays all into this. I really wasn't familiar about this at all, and it's very fascinating.
Oh, really? That's interesting. Actually, Ed Operman just said that to me yesterday too. But yeah, the Roundtable movement was where, of course, the Council on Foreign Relations and the the Royal Institute for International Affairs comes from, Chapman House, all that good stuff. So, kind of some of these longtime bugaboos of the conspiratorial right. But the Roundtable movement had its origins with Cecil Rhodes and the Rhodes Trust. I guess originally he had created a kind of secret society. I think it was the Society of the Elect or something to that effect, to essentially bring the British Empire into a truly world government, if you will, with a major emphasis on reuniting the United States and the UK, and then using that as a basis for essentially forming a global commonwealth, if you will. Though obviously, how much of an actual commitment there was to true globalism within this is debatable. I mean, as with many things, there were different factions at play within this whole movement. You did have some of the more idealistic types who did want something that we would later envision with the United Nations, but then certainly there were others who really had only ever desired a kind of Anglo-American empire, which they saw would have effectively been insurmountable for any of the other powers at the time. And this would essentially become a long-time fixation of the British establishment well after the Second World War had ended, and there really, at the time was no practical reason to think that it would even come about. But, that was something going into the research that was very surprising. There had been this sort of longing for years and years for that. And certainly, as we're getting into the 21st century with the decline of, American power combined with Brexit, which has now left, the UK kind of left adrift in a sense. Once again, I think that could be a major factor looking at plans long-term for the elites in the United States and the UK. Right now, you were to combine the two forces, it would give you something that would certainly pose a more formidable challenge going forward to the more volatile 21st century, if you will. And we might even have gotten a preview of this, going into the Bush 2 years and the so-called coalition of the willing in Iraq.
Now, you get into some of the origins of what is now considered Epstein's blackmail ring, and some of the shady dealings that was going on. When did this kind of form? And, talk a little bit about the origins of that.
Well, it's probably been around in some form or another for a very long time, but I think a lot of it was adapted from the British system, and it kind of grew out of this informal intelligence network, effectively, that the British kept in the U.S. In the interwar period. The head of it was Sir William Wiseman, who incidentally had actually been Crowley's handler in New York during the First World War. He had effectively been the head of all British intelligence in North America at the time. Afterwards, he theoretically retired from MI6, but seems to have, essentially kept this informal ring going. It was centered around these very exclusive gentlemen's clubs, such as the Room, which was in New York City. You had some kind of counterparts in the UK, like the Travelers Club. There was the Ends of the Earth Club, if I remember correctly. But these were, in some senses, kind of these, hoity-toity explorer clubs. A lot of, Anglo-American WASP types would get there and talk about their travels to Antarctica and that type of thing. But they did have value in enabling the British to keep tabs on what was going on in their various far-flung regions of the world. And of course, also it gave them access to many of the pillars of the American establishment. So it was another way to keep dibs on what they were doing. And this informal network really was what was brought out into the open as the full-blown intelligence services here during the Second World War. William Donovan had really cut his teeth, working in these gentlemen club circuits in the interwar years. And the other bill, of course, who was significant to all this was William Stevenson. Sir William Stevenson, the head of the British Security Coordination. I mean, he was another guy who had used these contacts in the gentlemen's club circuits. He came over to this country and he effectively took over Wiseman's role as head of British intelligence in North America. And he was really the guy, more than anything, who launched these blackmail rings. And specifically, when he got going on them, it was to get the United States initially to aid the British in their war efforts, and then later to enter the war full-blown on the side of the Allies. So, this went to the lengths where they had effectively entrapped a prominent isolationist senator, Arthur Vandenberg, with several mistresses that British intelligence had supplied, and he was blackmailed to support Lend-Lease. And then later, in the aftermath of the war, to forgive many of the debts to the British. And it's just really amazing, in this day and age with Russiagate and, all of the questions about foreign interference in this country. I mean, if you really want to get down to it, Stevenson is the guy who wrote the book on rigging elections in this country. I mean, besides entrapping politicians through, these various women, the guy would hire fake protesters to go and troll the America First Committee rallies. He would stalk them. I mean, he would send harassing letters to them. He would have exposés, written in newspapers about them if they had dug dirt up on them. He rigged polls. I mean, one of the major guys for Gallup was an agent of the British Security Coordination. So, you hear all of this stuff now that the left and the right both blame each other for, in terms of how elections have been undermined in this country, or they blame the Russians for, or whatever. A lot of this goes back to the British guys. And incidentally, the British, along with the Israeli prime ministers, are the ones who get to address our Congress, certainly not the Russians.
Yeah, it definitely does seem that way, that it goes back to the British and Israelis very often. Now, you mentioned the British Security Coordination. Talk a little bit more about its head, Sir William Stevenson, and it's actually very relevant today, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, the British Security Coordination, more than anything, is what the modern day CIA was based upon. And I mean, it was really a revolutionary institution at the time. I mean, Britain, at the onset of the Second World War, they had MI6, which is their foreign intelligence service. They had MI5, which was their domestic one. The Special Operations Executive, which did, the black stuff, the assassinations, bombings, that kind of crap. And then you had the Political Warfare Executive, which was their psychological warfare thing, and a couple of other agencies. But I mean, essentially, it was just this, whole litany of different agencies that were doing these different tasks. And there was a lot of overlap. There was a lot of institutional rivalry. And the SOE absolutely hated MI6 and vice versa. So anyway, when Stevenson set up his operation in North America, he basically combined all of these functions with the British Security Coordination. You're doing foreign intelligence, you're doing your counterintelligence, you're doing your propaganda, your covert operations. It's all sort of rolled together under one umbrella, so to speak. And that was the model that he passed on to Donovan for the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. And then obviously that was also the model that we later used for the CIA. And that's kind of something that a lot of people don't realize. I mean, in the UK, for instance, they did sort of roll together some of the things like covert operations with foreign intelligence, but, you know, you still have a pretty significant divide between like the counterintelligence functions of MI5 versus the foreign policy or the, you know, foreign initiatives that MI6 embarks upon. Whereas, yeah, I mean, the FBI here does do some counterintelligence stuff, but I mean, a lot of the major stuff is still handled by the CIA. And a lot of that ultimately was Stevenson's vision, this sort of Byzantine, you know, all-seeing intelligence service that could do all of these different functions.
Now, eventually, the BSC and the OSS are, you know, dismantled. What happens to these networks after supposedly they're you know, dismantled or shut down?
We obviously, you know, you had that 2-year gap, effectively, where the OSS is gone. There's no CIA yet until 47, and then on the other side of the pond, MI6 is still there. But you know, as I kind of said before, there have been major rivalries with the special operations executives, some of these other branches. MI6 doesn't want a lot of these guys, but you know, now you've got a situation where all of this quote unquote talent is on the street, and, you know, a lot of the major spy masters, a lot of the major players realize that we're already heading towards the Cold War. They've got to figure out somewhere that they can stash these assets. And that's what led to the rise of these, you know, kind of private intelligence networks that have become so prevalent in recent years. But at the onset, they really became a necessity for simply stashing away these assets. I mean, of course, the major one was the World Commerce Corporation, which William Donovan would become a director of in the post-war years. Sir William Stevenson would become a director of. Another guy involved with it who was really significant was Sir Charles Hambro, who had headed the Special Operations Executive. And I mean, these were, you know, again, directors, the senior guys overseeing all that, who then shifted gears into this enigmatic private company. And then, of course, they were joined with a host of veterans from the BSC, from the SOE, from the OSS. I mean, almost all of the major figures in the World Commerce Corporations were spies. And it does seem that effectively the purpose of these companies was to fill the gap until a proper intelligence service could be established in the US, and funding to some extent could be procured for these services in the UK.
Now, speaking of spies, I find this very interesting. Talk a little bit about Betty Pack, or codename Cynthia, who supposedly, you know, helped defeat the Nazis.
Yeah. She was Stevenson's principal sexpionage agent, I guess, if you will. Yeah, she was used to seduce multiple individuals at several embassies. I think initially it was like the Polish embassy, and then, of course, when she was sent back to America, she had been used to seduce multiple people in the French embassy, I guess, at the time. And it was later credited as being quite significant for Operation Torch, which was the Allied invasion of North Africa. She was credited with managing to come up with some pretty significant intelligence and the landing, and assisting us in keeping the casualties down, if I'm not mistaken. But she was a very interesting figure. She was actually an American girl, even though most of her work had been with British intelligence. She had come from a fairly high society type family, I believe, especially with her mother. You know, had kind of grown up in those exclusive sects and, you know, the old Eastern establishment haunts, if you will. She became sexually active at quite a young age. I think she had lost her virginity at like 13 or 14 to a 25-year-old Irish lad or something to that effect. So, you know, there was already that kind of, you know, decadence, if you will, in her life at a very young age. And then, of course, she did go into this more specific kind of work when she did become involved in espionage later.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Talk a little bit about, well, first of all, tell us what exactly the World Commerce Corporation is and how that also ties into everything.
The WCC, like I kind of alluded to before, it was used to stash all of these, these former spooks and what have you. And, they got up to some pretty shady business. Of course, they were partly established to kind of fill the void left by the German cartels, so to speak. But that raises some interesting possibilities. Of course, they established very close ties with the government of Taiwan not long after the communist Chinese had prevailed in the Civil War. Taiwan is basically an apartheid country. The nationalist Chinese were driven off the mainland. They constitute about 10% of the population. They took over Formosa, made it into Taiwan, and ruled it as effectively a one-party dictatorship for about 50 years or so. And arguably, it hasn't advanced much beyond that. But also, it was for many years one of the major drug centers of the world. The ruling political party, the KMT, was deeply implicated in heroin trafficking for many, many years. And it's quite likely that the World Commerce Corporation was instrumental in reestablishing this drug trade and possibly more activities related to that. Of course, they owned quite a few pharmaceutical companies, and in this era, it was not uncommon for illegal heroin to kind of make it in one way, be refined into morphine or something, and then kind of be lost in the shuffle and end up back in the hands of organized crime. Something that's not really talked about a lot, but quite a bit of the illicit narcotics had been provided by major cartels, German cartels, in the years leading up to the Second World War. And the World Commerce Corporation might have also been filling that void as well, among other things. There's been speculation, of course, that they were also used for those kind of Gladio networks that were set up in Europe afterwards. So in the World Commerce Corporation, it did a lot of shady stuff besides just, providing the CIA and MI6 a place to keep these invaluable assets at. I mean, it could also do a lot of off-the-books activities that would have been difficult for the official intelligence services to do. I mean, of course, the CIA needed plausible deniability. MI6 needed that too. But I mean, also the fact that the UK just wasn't as formidable as the Americans were at the time. They certainly needed even more distance.
Yeah, it seems like the WCC, was basically a giant drug dealing business with a few legitimate business fronts, right?
Yeah. I mean, it laundered some money. I mean, it also did just weird stuff like barter trade. I mean, I think it had arranged for, what was it, like Hungary, which was a communist country, to like provide paprika or something like that for medical supplies from like Austria or just, yeah, it was very strange. I mean, on the one hand, it kind of seemed like it was doing some of this legitimate barter trade. On the other hand, it's trying to help the KMT continue being major international drug traffickers. I mean, it wore a lot of hats, let's just say.
It also had links to the blackmail rings.
Yes, I mean, it does seem like that. One of the early presidents, John Pepper, had actually been one of the major guys involved in those blackmail rings with Stevenson with the British Security Coordination. In fact, Pepper had actually been Betty Peck, Cynthia's handler at one point during, I think it was like the late 30s, early 40s. He eventually became the head of the World Commerce Corporation. And then there was another leading American figure, Ricardo Sicri, I believe is how his name is pronounced. But this guy had actually been used as a sexpionage agent himself. Actually, he had seduced quite a few secretaries at the Spanish embassy and had procured access codes or something like that to their safes from them. So he himself had extensive firsthand experience working in blackmail operations.
Now, eventually, this relationship between U.S. and U.K. intelligence began to break down. Could you talk a little bit about how that came forth?
Yeah, well, I mean, really, the flashpoint was the Middle East. I mean, of course, the America had not had a lot of dealings in the Middle East up till that point in time in history, i.e., the Cold War, going into play. Previously, I mean, the Middle East had really been the dominion of the European powers. I mean, we had a bit of a toehold, let's just say, in Saudi Arabia, but that was about it. Now, of course, World War II happens. The European powers are decimated. Their colonial empires begin to recede. And in many cases, we were more than happy to try to, make that happen even faster. later. Basically, we wanted to try to get our own crony client states set up there to replace the ones that the British or the French had been using. And initially, this sort of started to become a factor in the whole issue with Iran. It's usually now depicted as being principally an American operation, but really it was the British who had gotten the ball rolling on overthrowing the prime minister who had been elected there and then replacing him with the Shah. Of course, the UK had ultimately had to go to the United States and ask for help. Originally, we didn't do that under Truman, but Eisenhower was a little more receptive. However, the cost was a cut of the oil. Up to that point, what eventually became BP, it effectively had a monopoly on Iranian oil, so they had to start giving up a cut of the pie. And then, of course, things really came to a head in Egypt a couple of years later with Nasser. We had effectively backed Nasser, and we had sponsored Odo Scherzini to effectively bring a lot of former Nazis there to help train his intelligence service, his military, and provide other expertise, quote unquote. Which is interesting because Scherzini had actually become a kind of partner for the World Commerce Corporation by that point in time. But anyway, that did not sit very well with the British. And of course, at the same point in time, you had guys like Charles Hambro, who were effectively working to overthrow Nasser on behalf of the British. So, I mean, it was almost kind of an institutional civil war between different guys aligned with the World Commerce Corporation in Egypt. So eventually the British, make an arrangement with the French, with the Israelis. The Israelis stage an invasion effectively, and that provides the British and the French pretext for to deploy paratroopers there. Everything's looking good so far. They think they're finally going to get rid of Nasser, but unfortunately, there's kind of a run on the British pound. They're starting to run out of oil. They don't know where they're going to get the money to get more, and they come to the United States and ask for a loan to tide them over while the war is ongoing, and the U.S. says no. And that basically marked the end of the British Empire. Because they had no way to continue this conflict and effectively had to acknowledge that they were wholly dependent on the Americans to project any kind of power. And if the Americans were not going to sponsor them in this, then they had no means of continuing the fight. It was just devastating for the British, and certainly it led to a whole kind of stab in the back mythos in certain segments of the British establishment as well. So that was a big thing for them, and it really, led to a break also with the relations between the intelligence services, between a whole factor of things. And for many years afterwards, it was kind of a preoccupation of the British establishment, how they could, maintain some degree of independence, especially in terms of their foreign policy, while being so dependent on the Americans for so many things.
Talk a little bit about Robert Maxwell, who was a member of Parliament, a spy, and how he was really related to this network.
Maxwell was basically a creation of the World Commerce Corporation. I mean, that's not something that's really talked about a lot now. But Maxwell, I mean, at the end of the Second World War, he had done a little work for British intelligence. He had also been, made some approaches with the KGB effectively by that point in time. But he had ended up working for a scientific publishing house. There was a merger of a British firm, Butterworth, and German one, Springer Verger or something, to become like Butterworth Springer. Anyway, it was not doing very well, but Maxwell had shown some real talent. The Germans were looking to get out of it, and they effectively, the British intelligence services were looking for somebody else to take over. Maxwell got the nod, and it was none other than Sir Charles Hambro, who had arranged a quite extensive loan for him to buy the company outright, and this company eventually became Pergamon Press, which was the flagship of Maxwell's business empire for years and years. And it was effectively a front for scientific espionage as well. I mean, the major thing that Pergamon was known for was publishing scientific research papers. This had led Maxwell to spend a lot of time in the Eastern Bloc, establishing the rights to these kinds of things. And Maxwell in the early days was just absolutely surrounded by veterans of the special operations executives. So, this just isn't really talked about a lot, but Maxwell really was very much a creation of the British intelligence services in the early days.
That's very interesting. What about talk about Julian Amory and his, how does he tie into this?
Well, Julian Amory was another one of these kind of accolades that the World Commerce Corporation network had raised up, and I mean, he was really Britain's, coup master par excellence through most of the Cold War. I mean, almost every black operation the British ran, beginning with Albania, going in through Iran, going through what was it, Syria, Egypt. I mean, all the way up through what was it, Cyprus? I think was the last major coup he was involved in, foreign at least. He was there basically. He was there usually with a bag full of pounds or gold, perhaps. Usually playing a central role. And in some cases, in Egypt, for instance, MI6's entire network had been rolled up by Nasser at one point. But Amory still had agents there. Basically, this guy was well funded. I mean, his father, Leopold Amory, was also quite a prominent politician, but I mean, was not that wealthy. And he essentially was able to maintain a vast network of agents, especially throughout the Middle East and other rather volatile areas of the world. Most likely that is because he was getting a lot of off the books funding from this World Commerce Corporation network. Of course, he was a veteran of the Special Operations Executive. He knew several of the people who were major figures in the broader World Commerce Corporation network. And of course, Sir Charles Hambro would have been his old boss in the Special Operations Executive. But, I mean, he was just a fascinating guy on a lot of levels, certainly a major figure in creating the modern day private military industry as well. And interestingly enough, in the case of Cyprus, in order to procure the continued use of bases there for their navy, Amory had employed MI6 to print some sexual blackmail material on the archbishop who took over the country, and that most likely seems to have been what had secured the continued British naval presence there. So, I mean, he had hands in that kind of thing, in addition to just all these different coups that he had been involved with for years and years.
Yeah, there's so many factions and clans involved in this. Talk a little bit about the Clan Fraser of Lovett and their significance and how their involvement affected everything.
If anybody's a fan of Outlander out there, they're actually the inspiration for Jamie's broader family. Of course, I think it was his uncle Simon the Fox was actually a real character. Simon Fraser, one of about a million Simon Frasers that have lived over the years. It's rather frustrating trying to write about the Lords of Lovett because they're all named Simon Fraser. It's like Simon Fraser the 15th, Simon Fraser the 16th, just endlessly. But in modern times, these guys were just instrumental in creating modern special operations forces. Of course, there was Shimmy Fraser, Lord Lovett the 15th, or something like that, who had been instrumental in setting up the commando schools that had trained a lot of the early British commandos in the Second World War. Of course, he was also the head of the Lovett Scouts, which was another early irregular warfare setup. His cousin David Sterling was one of the co-founders of the Special Air Services. These guys, I mean, really were just at the heart of creating modern day special operations forces. And they had established ties with Julian Amory going back to Oxford. Well, actually, even before then, Leopold had been a political colleague of the 14th Lord Lovett, I think. Um, one of them. But anyway, they had been involved in the Rhodes Trust together for years. They had brought the glorious institution of conscription to the UK for the First World War together, many other charming things. And then, of course, the relationship had continued when Julian had gotten to Oxford. He had befriended Shimmy Fraser's brother, which would become quite a fruitful relationship in the years to come. And they would once again collaborate quite closely in Yemen a couple of years after the Egyptian fiasco.
Now, in your first book, you wrote about the Profumo affair. That ties in as well. Could you kind of bring us back to that and tell us what that was all about?
Well, Profumo was a kind of love triangle that involved John Profumo, who had been a minister of Harold Macmillan's cabinet in the UK during the early 60s, and Christine Keeler, who was a showgirl, I guess, officially, and Yuri Ivanov, I believe. Ivanov was the Soviet military attaché, but he was actually also an agent of the GRU, which is the Soviet Union and still the Russians' private military intelligence service. And that was really the major issue. Profumo had begun an affair with Keeler that had lasted for several months, but prior to that beginning, she had slept with Ivanov, and Ivanov was aware of her affair with Profumo, who at the time was also married. So that had created a lot of complications, to put it mildly, for Harold Macmillan, and eventually it had brought down his government in 1963 when the scandal had emerged. Of course, though, the really big figure in this was Stephen Ward, the quote-unquote society osteopath, who effectively was the guy who had been procuring girls for a lot of these, really aristocratic sex parties and that type of thing that so fascinated the British establishment then, and probably still now.
Talk a little bit more about Stephen Ward's ring, and is there any evidence of occultism and what was going on there?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was very strange. I mean, of course, Ward, was known. There's not a lot of evidence that the girls the Ward's using were especially young. I mean, I think the youngest one I found evidence of was about 17. But he did specifically recruit women who could pass for being younger than that. They were effectively meant to be, looking around teenage years. Of course, he taught them some society manners, the proper clothes to use, what forks to use, that type of thing. And effectively groomed them for many of these VIPs in the British establishment. And yeah, I mean, one of the most striking things about Profumo is how much evidence there really is, and especially concrete evidence of occultism being practiced in these rings. Multiple sources that I've consulted have referred to Ward as having a keen interest in what is always referred to as quote unquote black magic. There's never really more given than that, so do with that what you will. But certainly there were descriptions of some of these parties. Of course, the cover to the book, I believe you've seen it by now, but that was an allusion to it. Effectively, they brought these women out in these, Masonic aprons with whips and that type of thing. Just other ones where you had like a master of ceremonies and women in masks. And so, yeah, there was very much a whole air of eyes wide shut to it. Another one of Ward's close partners was Hoyt Dibbins, I believe was his name, who ironically had also cut his teeth in the Plymouth Brethren as a child. That was, of course, the same sect that Aleister Crowley had been involved with. Plymouth Brethren does seem to have produced some individuals with keen interests in peculiar sexual practices and occultism, that should be said. Dibbins also had a lot of these orgies that had a lot of occult trappings at them. He also seems to have been involved in his own kind of blackmail operations as well. So yeah, it's just really incredible reading some of this stuff, and it's a bit surprising to me that many researchers haven't done more with some of these strange linkages. I mean, I've seen some accounts argue that effectively it was an attempt to, recreate the old Hellfire clubs from the 18th century. It might have been, there might have been some ties to Crowley. I mean, I don't want to say that concretely, but there had been, people like, what was his name, Lord Tredegar or something like that. Some of these connections as well lingering in the background. So it was definitely an interesting assortment of figures involved in all of this stuff.
Yeah, when you're looking at all this stuff, you definitely can't ignore the occult aspect of it. I have plenty of researchers, that are looking into things such as the JFK assassination and, some of these sex trafficking rings, and they don't look at the occult or what they consider woo-woo stuff because it's too out there for them. But these people actually, they take it pretty seriously. It's pretty, it's pretty important to them because they involve it in all of the things they're involved with. So this occult stuff is very, it seems to play a key role into their operations.
Yeah, well, I mean, and another thing that I get into in the book, I mean, most people do tend to fixate on like just the woo-woo aspects of occultism, but I mean, I do think there actually are possibly more mundane explanations for why you see it so prevalent in some of these rings. I mean, on the one hand, especially kind of getting back into this era, I mean, the 1960s or something like that, even having like a prominent politician, photographed just, being involved in an occultic ritual, even if it doesn't involve sex, would have been very scandalous. I mean, to some extent in this day and age, especially if it was a prominent Republican, it still would be. So, I mean, there is that kind of element to it. But I think even more relevant, though, is just as a means to discredit the witnesses effectively. Because, I mean, especially in this day and age, in the post Epstein, post Jimmy Savile years, most people, are pretty open to the ideal that there are these elite sex rings that deal in underage women and boys and so forth. But you start talking about rituals and black capes and what have you. I mean, automatically you're going to be dismissed as a crackpot. But I mean, that kind of begs the question, was that why so much of this stuff shows up? I mean, did it occur to somebody? Well, I mean, if we do come out with some robes and do a little bit of token ritualism, if somebody ever tries to talk about this kind of stuff, they're automatically going to, discredit themselves immediately. So, I mean, I do think, not to discount the fact that there are serious believers involved in this stuff. I mean, I certainly think that there are. But I do think that a lot of people who participate in this stuff are doing it because they do perceive it as having a more practical value, essentially.
Very interesting. Talk about some of the more crucial American players that were involved with Profumo.
But yeah, I mean, again, there's William Mellon Hitchcock, of course, the guy I had alluded to before. I mean, he was a big figure in the Mellon family of Pittsburgh, the famous banking dynasty. They also owned Gulf Oil and just all kinds of other stuff. I mean, they're still major players in this country. But Mr. Billy, as he was known by the Help, is probably most notorious now for the role that he played in launching LSD in this country in the 1960s. He had been Timothy Leary's patron, had opened up his good offices at his Millbrook estate in New York for Leary back in the 60s. And then later he had become the financier for the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which was the largest LSD smuggling ring in the world by the late 1960s, at which point he had passed that whole operation on to Ronnie Stark. But Hitchcock, I mean, big guy in spreading LSD, but before he got going and all of that, he shows up in the UK involved in these strange sex parties that Stephen Ward and Hoyt Gibbons were throwing, and he had a flat in the UK that they might have also been using to hold some orgies at. His roommate at the time was a very interesting figure, another American who went by the name of Thomas Corbally. He was a private detective, though, I mean, he was usually described as an international businessman, though he also did a lot of moonlighting, both for organized crime and for the U.S. intelligence services. Corbally, a lot of times, is described as an OSS veteran, but that's never really been conclusively proven, though it does seem like he worked with military intelligence in the aftermath of the Second World War and maybe the CIA for a few years afterwards. But regardless, Corbally would leave intelligence work in the late 1940s and then would become a jet setter. And he would have an uncanny ability for showing up in sexual blackmail rings all across the world. He was a good friend of Heidi Fleiss, the so-called Hollywood madam. He was actually the guy who came up with the money for her to pay her attorneys and so forth back in the early 90s. Of course, in exchange for her not leaking the names of any of her clients to the press. Of course, he was in Profumo, and then, of course, he showed up in the 1980s and all of the stuff that was surrounding Roy Radin. Of course, everybody knows from the whole Son of Sam thing, it kind of came out that Radin was kind of a part of this bizarre S&M scene that was unfolding in Long Island, some of these different, upstate mansions in New York. Again, you have this kind of whole, era or aura of Eyes Wide Shut, effectively. Corbally was described as the godfather of this whole scene. So, you've got this guy, I mean, you just keep showing up in a lot of these really exclusive sex rings, effectively, for multiple decades. all the while he's doing work for some very interesting figures. There was, of course, Sir James Goldsmith, who would be a leading figure in Brexit in the UK. There was Roy Cohn, the infamous attorney slash political mentor of Donald Trump. Cohn was a regular employer of Corbally, and Corbally considered Cohn to be a bit of a political mentor as well. And there was Donald Trump himself, who also employed Thomas Corbally at various times. So Corbally got around quite a bit.
Now, speaking of Donald Trump, Resorts International actually factors into all this as well. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, Trump took over Resorts International in 1987. He became the CEO of it effectively. But even before then, William Mellon Hitchcock had actually been one of the major investors in Resorts International. So, you had that whole kind of tie to Perfumo. And then another one of the Americans who showed up in Perfumo who was involved in Ward's Ring was Huntington Hartford, the A&R supermarket heir. He was the guy who had actually bought what was Hogs Island. He turned it into Paradise Island, and that was where the Resorts Casino was established in the Bahamas. He was a stockholder as well in Resorts. So, you had all these kind of odd connections there, even before Trump, took over in the 1980s. It's just a really strange set of circumstances with all of this. And then, of course, Corbally, what was it? Another one of his mentors. It was another private detective, Steve Brody, who had also done some work for the CIA at various points. Brody was also connected to the brother Peter Crosby of the longtime head of Resorts, James Crosby. And Peter Crosby, incidentally, was the guy who later sold Trump the shares in Resorts that enabled him to take over the company in the 1980s. So, it was kind of this incestuous network, effectively.
Now, Profumo, it actually plays into the JFK assassination. I know that's a whole other podcast in itself, but could you talk a little bit about how that, how it does?
Well, yeah, essentially JFK had gotten ensnared in Stephen Ward's ring. There's pretty compelling evidence that he had slept with not one, but not two girls in Ward's ring, and that created some pretty significant problems. Of course, JFK having extramarital affairs, that was not shocking to anybody in Washington power establishments by the early 1960s. But the problem with being implicated in Ward's ring is the fact that there, was compelling evidence that the KGB had also penetrated this ring. So now, you've got the president of the United States in a ring that Soviet spies had potentially penetrated. That was very problematic on a lot of levels.
Now, Profumo is also very significant to what's going on in present day with the whole Epstein scandal. Can you talk about how it kind of, bring us to modern times and how it all ties in with Epstein?
Well, yeah, on the one hand, I think it just, it illustrates so much. Effectively how the real life Game of Thrones amongst the establishment is played. Perfumo, as I kind of alluded to before, was instrumental in bringing down Harold Macmillan's government. But the reasons why it was brought down, I think, are really quite different than what has been the conventional explanations that historians have provided up to this point, which is one of the big focuses of the book. But I also think it was instrumental too in the Kennedy assassination. Certainly it wasn't the only factor behind Kennedy's assassination, but the fact that you did have the president of the United States possibly compromised by Soviet intelligence in this way was it was very problematic. It could create a lot of issues, to put it mildly. And when evidence of Profumo breaking started to come out, the Kennedy administration was terrified of this. So, you did have this whole component of the Game of Thrones, which I think is really relevant to what we're seeing playing out now with Trump. But even more pertinent are the family connections. That was really the thing that jumped out to me when I was looking at Epstein's Black Book, is how many of the families, especially the British ones, show up in Profumo. I mean, you've got some of the American ones. I mean, obviously the Kennedys are in there, but I mean, you look at some of the other names, the Astors, the Mountbattens, the Goldsmiths, and of course the Maxwells and other ones. I mean, a lot of these guys were also implicated in Profumo. And it does raise a lot of interesting questions about, whether or not this is kind of an intergenerational, multi-generational type of thing. I mean, I don't think it's coincidental that you do see these same families showing up in these rings over and over again over the years. And that is, I think one of the more interesting elements of the Epstein ring that's not really being considered. It didn't just emerge in a vacuum. I mean, this was an extension of something that's been building for many, many years now.
Yeah, and obviously this is an ongoing saga that's continuing to play out. But do you see anything as far as anything more being brought to light in the next, I guess, say few months, anything major when it comes to the whole Epstein scandal, any major arrests or more revelations to come, anything that you've heard about?
Well, I mean, nothing that I've heard yet, but I mean, certainly, I think it's got to be in play with the election only a couple of weeks away at this point. I don't think that it was a coincidence that they decided to arrest Ghislaine just, randomly after what they had known that she was hiding out in New Hampshire for almost a year or something like that. I mean, I do think that there was some kind of plan for that. And then, of course, if Trump loses, Biden gets in there. I mean, that could also be a way to, launch essentially a major body blow against his administration, just as it's getting settled in. I mean, it's difficult to say, but I mean, I do think that we have not seen the last of the Epstein thing by a long shot at this point. Certainly, I don't think it's played as big of a role in the 2020 election as I had anticipated at this point. But then again, nobody really could have anticipated what 2020 was going to be like. So, but like I said, we've still got a couple of weeks to the election, and it is 2020. I mean, anything is possible. So.
Now, speaking of the election coming up, 2020 was so insane. The election, everything surrounding it is so surreal and insane. The candidates are insane. This whole situation, it seems to be building to something that's coming to a head. I don't know what it is. There's division on both sides. There's fear being spread. Like you said earlier, there is a psychological warfare campaign at play. There's so much going on for this particular election. It seems like one of the hugest years in modern history, really. There's so many things that are occurring right now that are steering our society. What do you have any predictions, any thoughts about what could possibly happen after the election? Whatever way it goes, if it goes for Trump, if it goes for Biden, what do you see happening? I see, some turmoil either way.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think in the immediate aftermath, there probably is going to be a period of turmoil. But I also think, though, the crackdown will be coming again, though, regardless of who wins as well. Because the Democrats have really been taking a beating over the ongoing protests and or riots, depending upon one's point of view on this. But certainly I don't think that it's going to be practical to keep this thing going endlessly for a lot of reasons, and certainly in a lot of ways, I think Biden would have a lot more cover for actually going on and doing a massive crackdown on this kind of stuff that Trump would. And certainly with the months of protests that have already been happening, DHS has probably been provided with ample photographs and other resources to identify protesters, have the lists ready,
Right.
the proper suspects, under surveillance and so forth. So I do kind of think as well, when the crackdown comes, it's going to be very swift. I don't think a lot of people have really considered that, but yeah, it's definitely going to be very interesting. But I mean, I think, what I think we're seeing a lot of now effectively is a lot of middle management and just useless dead weight is being cut away right now. I mean, I know Chris Knowles, the great Chris Knowles, the Secret Sun, has speculated about that. in regards to the Harvey Weinstein scandal. I mean, the
Right.
fact that some of the Me Too stuff is effectively a cover to effectively, get rid of some of the dead weight in Hollywood. I mean, it's just not profitable anymore. You've got these bloated salaries, stars that just aren't bringing in the bucks anymore. So, it provides cover to get rid of some of these clowns. And I mean, I kind of think to some extent that might be another thing that the Epstein scandal will be used for going into 2021. And then certainly the ongoing geopolitical fiasco. I mean, that's going to be a big issue too, as to who wins the election. I mean, certainly, I think the Russians and the Chinese are very interested in that, for a
Yeah.
variety of reasons. But I do think, though, that Trump has frayed relations with China to some extent, though, that there's probably no going back at this point. So I don't know that there will be the kind of reversal in that maybe some members of the liberal establishment are hoping for.
Yeah, it's definitely a year to look towards. Very interesting. Stephen, I want to thank you again so much for coming on. Before you head out, maybe give us a little teaser about your next two books, some of the information it might be about.
Well, the second one, definitely, we're going to really look a lot at Le Cercle, which was just so implicated in a lot of these different, pedophile rings, really across the world. I mean, they show up in Detroit and the Franklin scandal here in the United States, and of course, Savile in the UK. Going to get into Kincora and a lot of other stuff like that. And then, of course, in the third book, there's probably going to be a lot of emphasis on what I think is the old Drexel Burnham Mafia, with Michael Milken and all those guys. It really played quite a significant role in the rise of Trump and Brexit. So that's going to be a major point of discussion in that book. But it's going to cover a lot of just incredible personalities, a lot of people you haven't seen mentioned in regards to this stuff. And hopefully it's going to really rewrite a lot of narratives on recent history.
Awesome. Looking forward to that. Stephen, thank you again so much for coming on. We'll definitely have you on for the next one, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Yeah, you too, sir.